Hello and welcome to this introductory video for the iReal shaders, and that's going to be iFabric and iMetal. So to begin this, I want to answer a question that I got on the DAS forum about how these shaders work when it comes time to convert a pre-existing product from the DAS iRay Uber shader over to iFabric or iMetal. In this case, we're going to be using iFabric, but the same principles will apply to iMetal. So first off, I want to point out to you that I'm currently using this product, which is the D-Force Retro Sweatshirt for Genesis 8 females and males. I'm currently using this preset right here, which is the Retro Sweatsuit Set Dark Plain, and I've got that applied to the objects in the scene. Now I want to point out to you what this looks like. So I'm going to come down to the sweatpants and just go to the pants so that we can quickly see what this is. Now, the first thing I want to point out to you is that unlike most products that you'll be finding in DAS, this is using a different type of base. So typically what you'll find for your base in most iRay Uber shader materials that you're going to find on the DAS store are going to be PBR metallicity roughness. This product happens to be using the weighted, and this is going to change some of the parameter conversion. The parameter conversion works better if you're using the PBR metallicity roughness. However, if your product doesn't come that way, just know that some of the parameters are not going to be transferred over. So let's just go ahead and talk about that for a second. The base color will be transferred over, so we don't need to worry about that setting right there. And the glossy weight ideally would be transferred over. However, in this case, it won't be because of the fact that this is a weighted. And then over here, where our glossy color is not going to be transferred over. However, our normal map will be transferred over. And these guys down here, all this stuff in green, that is your top coat. None of this is going to get transferred over. So what we would want to do before we did the conversion is we would want to go ahead and take a look at some of the textures and know where they belong and what setting should be used for them in order for us to get a similar result out of the box. So the first thing you can see here is that this texture has the path of FD RetroSuit 1T, and I suppose that is for transparency, or I'm not exactly sure what that T stands for. But at any rate, that's the one that we're going to be looking for. So what I want to do now is just go ahead and select all these surfaces for the entire 3 set for this product right here, which is going to be the shoes, the pants, and the shirt. I'm going to come over here to my shader presets, iRay, Half-Life, iReal shaders. Now within that, you're going to find that we're going to have a couple of additional folders. And I just need to twirl this open here. We have our iFabric presets and our iMetal presets. These are not good for conversions. These would be the things that you would use if you were starting from scratch, or you just wanted to go ahead and put an entirely different product on there. These guys are going to plug in their own values, and as a result, they're not going to convert very well. However, the base shaders that you would find in this initial folder, and of course, this would also show up in Smart Content. I'm showing it here so that you can always find it if you need to find it and Smart Content isn't behaving properly. But you can see here, we only got 2 shaders. We've got the iFabric base, we've got the iMetal base. We also have links to the PDF manuals for each of these, and I do recommend that you check these out. I put a lot of work into these manuals. They cover a lot of background information that will tell you what the parameters do and why they work the way they work, and hopefully help you to get better materials as a result. Now that said, I'm going to go ahead and put the iFabric on all of these by simply double-clicking it. It's going to take a second for it to do its thing. And when it's done, every one of these surfaces will be converted over to iFabric. But I'm going to go ahead and focus on just the pants for this video. And you can see that indeed my base color came over, and I also have my normal map, which came over. So I don't need to worry about those two. However, there is a glossy layer weight here, and I need to go ahead and load that. So I'm just going to go ahead and click and hold, and then come over here and choose the T here for the Retro Suit T. And that's going to be the texture that was used before there. And I can also look at some of these other parameters. So we have a roughness of 0.7, which is fairly rough. And we also have an anisotropy set to 0, which basically makes the anisotropy features disappear. If I set this up a little bit, you'll see we have our anisotropy rotations and anisotropy weave blend that are below here. If I set this to 0, they go away. Likewise, if I come over here to sheen, you can see that I have the sheen default settings. The reason why that is because when we're working from a pre-existing product, sheen has no analog when we're working with a iRay Uber shader. So it's going to come in as the default settings. If you want sheen to go away for some reason, if you're not wanting to build a product that has sheen, just go ahead and set it to 0 and those parameters will go away. But the second you go higher than 0, it's going to pop those parameters out. If you want to go back to the default settings, just click the gear and say reset, and that'll give you the default settings. And for this purposes of this particular video, seeing the default settings will probably be pretty useful. Now, that said, I just want to go ahead and take a look at the other parameters that we're not talking about here. Now, metallicity is not going to be particularly useful for this because metallicity would primarily be for metallicized fabrics or things like velvet and satin. And if you twirl this guy a little bit higher, you'll see that we have a couple additional parameters that pop out about this. I'm not going to talk about this for right now. I just wanted to point out to you that if you were expecting to see more parameters or less, then just know that it's dial dependent, meaning that this dial is set to 0, they go away. The dial is set higher than 0, they pop out. Likewise, we have over here a grazing color. And the grazing color is going to be the color that's seen around the edges of the fabric. So what I mean by that is when we're looking straight on, when the normal of the camera and the normal of the polygon are facing directly towards each other, then the base color will be the color. And as we get further and further around towards the edge to the 90-degree angle, we're going to be doing more and more of the grazing color. Now, for most objects, and especially for the cotton objects, having a grazing color of white is fine. However, you can also come in here and take that same texture or a related texture and load it in order to control how this grazing color works. So now that I have that information, what I want to do is I first want to go ahead and deal with this grazing color ID. So I'm just going to go ahead and select all of these guys so that we're just focusing on this for right now. And I'm going to ignore the fact that some of the things probably didn't need to get converted, like that sole for the shoe. We're not going to worry about that for right now, but I am going to come over here and I'm going to show you what this grazing color does. So I'm going to turn on my NVIDIA iRay preview. And now that I've done that, it's going to give me a preview render. And the only thing that has that glossy layer weight that we were talking about right now is the pants. So I would need to go through each of these materials and make sure that they all have that same setting. And you can see there is a difference between the pants and everything else as a result of that. But for right now, I'm just going to ignore that. And the easiest way I can do that is just come back over here and say none on that. And the reason why is because it's not really relevant to the thing that I want to talk about. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the glossy layer weight and I'm going to set it all the way to 0 so that we're not even dealing with the glossy layer weight on any of these. Now, we're seeing primarily the fall off of the sheen right now because the glossy layer weight is no longer valid. And the sheen, if I set this to 0, will get down to sort of the base level of this. So right now, if we're seeing any fall off at all, where that's coming from is this white color. Now, if I set this white color down to black, and I say okay, you're going to see that it changes significantly. If I change it back to white, you're going to see it changes. So this grazing color has an impact, but it's mostly at the grazing edges. And that's going to be primarily controlled by the fall off exponent. So I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to set it to something different, like say a green color, so that you can really see this. You can see now we have this green around the edges. And that is what I'm talking about when I talk about the 90-degree. So at the 0-degree, we're getting the pure gray. And at the 90-degree, we're getting the green, and there is a fall off between the two. That fall off, in the case of a perfectly rough material like what we have here, where we have no metallicity, is primarily controlled by this fall off exponent. So the fall off exponent is going to be more strong if you reduce it and less strong if you increase it. So I'm going to increase it all the way up to 5. And you can see we basically don't see that green at all, or if it's there, it's very, very weak. Now, if I come over here and I set it to the standard for what we would typically see on a fabric, as far as the IOR, or index of refraction, I'm going to set that to 1.5, and you're going to see a very strong green come in. So the green basically dominates at this point, and only at the very, very, very most 0 portions are you still seeing the gray, and virtually everything else is green. And so in this way, by controlling the fall-off exponent, you can control the amount of that secondary color. Well, that's also true of white. So if you're getting too much white, and you want to go ahead and, took me a second there, let me hit cancel. Took me a second to see that. If you're getting too much white and you want to pull that back, well, the way you handle that is by changing over here the fall off exponent until you get the amount of that white that you want. Now, if you set it all, like I said, all the way to 5, then what'll happen is effectively you'll only be using the base color and the grazing color is more or less ignored. Now, if you have the metallicity on and you have a low roughness, then the fall off exponent works a little bit differently because the way that it works between a diffuse object like what we have here, the way it works with a metal object is very different. But for this particular object, we never had any metallicity in the first place because the original product did not have metallicity. Likewise, if we wanted this to be darker, the gray, to match the dark gray that we see here. Well, the easiest way of handling that would be to simply come over here to your base color, ignore the chip for now, and just come over here and change the color for this to something like, say, 200. And by making that darker, what you're going to see is we get that darker gray. And the darker this is, the darker the gray will be. And again, if I increase that, or I decrease that fall off exponent down to 3, you'll see we get more of that white coming back in, right? So it's really about controlling that fall off. That's the idea here, is you want to pay attention to these two and the fall off exponent to get the base level of diffuse colored shift that you get from your 0 degree to your 90 degree. That's the first thing you have to be worried about. Now, of course, you can always load a texture in here. And in the case of what we're doing with this particular one, I could even load the same texture. So maybe I'll come over here to the pants and I'll choose all 3 of these. And you can see they're all using the same texture. It's Retro Suit 3T. So I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to choose Retro Suit 3T. And you're going to see that now that is darker. Now it's still going to be brighter because you can see the base color here is a value of 200 and the maximum value is 255. So that's making everything darker on the base color. And here it's a value of 255, which means that there's still going to be some curvature. And of course, like I said, if you pull this down, you're going to see more and more of that curvature come in. But the base value of 3 is pretty good for most purposes. That's the reason why I set it as the default. Now, once we have that worked out and we know basically what our diffuse color is, what you can think of as the base color of the object. And I guess for the purposes of what we're doing here, I'll come over here and I'll do the same thing on the shirt. So I'm going to come over here and grab that Retro Suit 3T. And now that I've got that, what I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and grab all these guys and go ahead and add that glossy layer weight texture back in. So it's going to be a Retro Suit 1T, I do believe. Yes, that's what it was. And I'm going to increase that glossy layer weight. Now, what I want you to see is that as I increase that glossy layer weight, I'm adding more and more white back in. Now, where that white is coming from is the reflection that is created by this roughness here. Now, I could control that roughness by putting a texture here. If the product had a roughness texture, then that would obviously be controlling it. But I can also control how much impact this has by simply controlling this glossy layer weight. And it will take whatever the texture is and it will modify it based on this number. So we can basically have a small amount of glossy layer weight or a large amount of glossy layer weight. Typically, my advice would be, whatever your roughness is, have the opposite for your glossy layer weight. Meaning that if your roughness is 70, set your glossy layer weight to 30. And the reason why is because whatever you have in terms of an increased roughness, you're going to be increasing that white content. Meaning that a low roughness, it doesn't look white at all, it looks shiny. However, as you increase the roughness, it gets whiter and whiter and whiter. And because the shader has the grazing color and the fall off exponent and also the sheen, which we haven't even gotten to yet, you don't want to get too crazy with this, because as you start stacking these effects, you're going to get to something that basically looks pure white, even though it's supposed to be a dark jersey. So now that I've got the roughness and the glossy layer weight figured out, the next thing I would do is I would come over here to sheen and I would add the sheen back in. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and reset that back to its default value of 0.30, or as I like to say sometimes, 30. This also has a default value of 0.375. It gets rounded up to 0.38, but that's not actually accurate. It's really 0.375. So the two parameters that we're really worried about here are the sheen and the sheen roughness. And this is laid on top of everything else. So it's added to the glossy layer weight. So if your glossy layer weight is too high and you have too high of a grazing color, it's too white, and then you add sheen on top of it, you're going to get to a light gray instead of having a dark gray. So that's just, like I said, the balance that you want to be aware of as you're doing your conversions. But I'm going to go ahead and, for right now, just crank the sheen all the way up so that you can really see what it's doing. So with the sheen, this is going to be tied to the glossy index of refraction. So for right now, I'm just going to set the glossy layer weight back down to 0. And I'm going to go ahead and take that glossy IOR all the way up to 3. Okay, and the index of refraction of 3 is way, way too high. However, this is really going to show us what's going on with the sheen. So with the sheen set to 1, we're getting the maximum power of sheen, which is controlled by this glossy IR. It's basically like an opacity. And the sheen roughness is going to control sort of the fall off of the sheen, meaning that at a low roughness, we're going to be primarily focusing on just the grazing edges, the 90-degree edges. And at a high roughness, we're going to be basically adding that roughness to everything, right? So that's not necessarily a good thing on something like this. We don't want that high roughness. So you want to go ahead and do what I'm doing here. Like I said, take the glossy IOR up to 3, which is basically the maximum that I would ever use it as. Go ahead and adjust the dials here until you get a good fall off for the effect. Maybe something around here looks good for this particular effect. It's just catching the edges and really showing them off. And then reduce the sheen power until you get down to something that's reasonable, where it pops out, but it's not like super, super noticeable. Something like that. That looks good. I'm seeing the sheen. It looks like little fuzzies that you would typically see on some sort of jersey or something like that. And then what I'll do is I'll come back over here to my glossy IOR and I'll just reset that back to the default value of 1.491. Now, why do I use that default value of 1.491? Well, that is typically what a clear coat plastic would be. And a lot of threads are coated with something that is basically in the same ballpark. And so the reason why you would want to set this here is because it would mimic the shininess of thread. And so that's the reason why I have it set for that. Now, once I have that, I can go back and I can add back in my glossy layer weight, which, as we already described, was going to be 0.3 or 30 as a result of this being 70 or 0.7. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit enter on that. And that's basically my conversion in a nutshell. I've converted this product from this to this as a result of the changes. And what's going to happen is I'm going to get enhanced fall off and reactivity to light as a result of things like the sheen and the glossy layer weight and the roughness. All of these things are going to work together in order to give me a much more realistic and softer looking fabric that's going to have a nice fall off. So that's basically converting when you're using the iFabric. And there are other ways of using this, obviously, if we wanted to make this into a multicolor type of jersey instead of having it be a dark gray jersey. However, I didn't want to focus on that. I wanted to focus mostly on just converting and seeing how we can increase the realism and the softness of this fabric by using iFabric and starting from the pre-existing MDL material that someone created in their product. Thank you.